The fog came in early that evening, the way it always did in late autumn along the northern coast, low and slow, rolling off the water until the lanterns at the end of the pier were just soft smears of amber in the gray. Emmett Caldwell had lived with that fog for 31 years. What he did not expect on a Tuesday in November was the sound of a small keel being walked in by hand through the shallows of the south approach, and a child's voice, very quiet, asking which light was the pier. He went to look. He always went to look. The vessel was a single-masted coasting skiff, well-built and well-kept, with the kind of running stitches along the mainsail seam that said someone had been working on it while underway. The woman handling the bowline was tall, orc-tall, green-skinned, with heavy braids wrapped back and a salt-stiffened oilskin coat that had seen several hard seasons. She was walking the bow in through the shallows with her boots off, the water at her knees, moving with the careful patience of someone who had done this in bad light 100 times before and knew the one wrong step that mattered. Behind her, perched on the deck with her boots on and a wool blanket around her shoulders, was a small figure. A girl, watching the lights of the pier with the particular stillness of a child, who is very tired and has learned not to say so. Emmett took the line when the bow cleared the last sandbar. He clove-hitched it to the nearest post without being asked. The woman looked at him. Her eyes were dark and level, and there was something in them that was not quite surprise, more like a careful reassessment. People did not generally help with the line. They generally stepped back. "Fair birth rate," Emmett said. "Same as anyone. There's a ring on the east side if you want to run a stern line." She studied him for a moment. Then she waited the last few steps and took the stern line herself, barefoot on the dock planks in November, and did not ask for help with that either. Her name was Sura Vane, and she told him so when he wrote it in the birth register, standing in the small harbor office with the lamp on the desk between them. Her daughter's name was Wren. The girl was 7, or close to it, small-boned and watchful, with her mother's dark eyes and her mother's habit of reassessing before she spoke. Emmett asked how long they'd need the birth. "One night," Sura said. He wrote it down. Then he said, without looking up from the register, that there was a storeroom at the back of the harbor office that he used for dry goods and spare cordage, and that it had a stove and a cot frame, and a stack of wool blankets from the chandler's last delivery. He said the chandler wouldn't miss them until spring. He said the storeroom was warmer than the skiff and drier than the public birthhouse down the lane, and that if she wanted it, it was hers for the night at no cost beyond the birth fee. Sura looked at him again, that same careful look. "My daughter is cold," she said after a moment. It was not an answer. It was just a fact she had chosen to say out loud. "The stove takes about 10 minutes, Emmett said. The storeroom was close and low-ceilinged, smelling of rope and salt and the particular dusty warmth of things stored long. Emmett lit the stove while Sura brought Wren inside and settled her on the cot with the blankets. The girl was asleep before the stove was fully drawing, her breathing evening out in the slow way of children who have been holding themselves, too, still for too long. Sura stood with her back to the stove and told him, in a few plain sentences, what had happened at the port warden's office. She had sailed into the harbor at 3:30. She had gone to the port warden, a man named Greaves, whom Emmett knew and did not particularly like, to pay the warden's tariff and register her cargo declaration. Greaves had looked at her papers, and then at her, and then at her papers again, and told her there was an irregularity in the vessel's registration that would require the skiff to remain impounded in the warden's yard until the matter was reviewed. He had not told her how long a review might take. He had charged her the impound fee. Emmett listened to all of it without expression. When she was done, he said that Greaves did that there was a particular kind of irregularity he had been finding in the papers of vessels he took a dislike to, for reasons that had nothing to do with the papers, and that it generally resolved itself when presented with a small courtesy fee, which was not a thing Emmett was suggesting she pay. "What is it you're suggesting?" Sura asked. "That you leave Greaves to me in the morning," Emmett said, "and get some sleep." She did not sleep. He did not expect she would. When he came back to bank the stove at midnight, he found her sitting at the small work table with a cup of tea she had made from his shelf and a piece of paper on which she had drawn, in fine close lines, a current chart of the south approach, the sandbar positions, the tide shelf depth at the channel's edge, a correction to the old posted chart that had been wrong for 3 years at least. She slid it across the table when she saw him looking. "The south channel runs 2 feet shallower than your board says," she said, "on the ebb." Emmett studied it. The lines were exact. The soundings were marked to the inch. "I ran it by feel tonight," she said. "But you'll want it posted." He took the chart. He said he would post it in the morning. And then, because the stove was warm and the night was long and Wren was sleeping, they sat at the table and talked, not about the warden or the impound, but about the harbor and what it used to be when 6 trade vessels a week called at the wharf and the chandler kept 3 boys busy. Sura listened the way she had listened to the approach channel in the dark, carefully, assembling a picture she would need later. She told him about navigating the coast alone, since her husband died 3 years back. The routes she ran, the deep water passage most coastal pilots wouldn't take after September, about Wren, who knew the tide tables before she knew her numbers. She said it without self-pity, the way you describe conditions to another navigator. Emmett said it sounded like a hard 3 years. Sura said most things worth doing were hard. He came back to the storeroom at first light and found her on the east pier in the cold, standing at the capstan with a wrench and a length of new line from somewhere on her skiff. The capstan had been frozen on its pawl for 8 months. Emmett had been meaning to address it since March. When he reached the pier, she was tightening the last fitting, the drum turning free and clean on its post for the first time since winter. She did not say anything about it. She handed him the wrench and went back inside. Greaves arrived at 8:30 with his warden's book and his particular face. He found Emmett at the harbor office door and began to talk about the irregularity in the orc woman's papers. Emmett let him talk. He was a patient man. Then, when Greaves had finished, Emmett took the warden's book from under his arm, turned to the registration section, and pointed to the clause governing impound review timelines and the required written documentation that Greaves had not filed. Greaves did not have the documentation. Emmett said that was a significant irregularity and that he would be happy to report it to the harbor authority in the city if Greaves would prefer that process. He said it quietly, without heat, looking directly at the man. The skiff was released by 9 o'clock. Sura pulled it back to the wharf herself without ceremony and retied it at her berth. She was coiling the last line when Wren came running down the pier, still in her blankets, pointing at the harbor mouth with the urgency of someone who has just seen something that cannot wait. Emmett turned to look. The fog had broken in the night, the way it sometimes did along this stretch of coast. All at once, the whole gray curtain lifting, and the water going flat and bright in the morning sun. And there, at the harbor mouth, sitting in the slow swell at anchor drift, were 7 vessels. Deep water traders, all of them, with the wide-beamed hull lines of ocean passage ships. Their flags were aloft. Emmett had not seen 7 vessels at his harbor mouth in 4 years. Sura stood at the end of the pier and looked at them for a long moment. Wren had come to stand beside her, still wrapped in the borrowed blanket, one hand at her mother's coat. "They've been waiting at the outer mark since midnight," Sura said. "They won't come in without a signal from me. The approach channel along this headland is one of the worst on the coast. There's no one else they'll trust to bring them through." Emmett looked at the 7 ships, and then at the channel, and then at the current chart she had drawn at midnight, which he had already tacked up on the board. "Can you bring them in?" he said. "All 7, she said, on the morning tide." She did it in 4 hours, one ship at a time, standing on the bow of her skiff with a hand flag and a voice that carried above the wind. She called the berths in order, and Emmett had them ready, which meant that by the time the 4th vessel was warped in, he was running a tighter operation than he had in years, his old instincts waking from a long sleep. Wren sat on the capstan, the newly repaired capstan, watching her mother work, eating a piece of bread that the cook from the 2nd vessel had handed down to her. By early afternoon, the wharf had more life in it than Emmett could remember. There were crates on the dock and voices in 3 languages and the smell of coffee from the trade ship galleys. The chandler, old Norris, had come down from his shop and was standing open-mouthed at his own storefront, counting ships. Emmett found Sura at her skiff when the last line was made fast. She was coiling rope with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. He stood at the edge of the pier and waited until she looked up. "Will you be sailing in the morning?" he asked. Sura looked at her daughter, who had fallen asleep against a coil of line on the dock, the borrowed blanket still around her shoulders, one small boot hanging off the edge in the particular way of children who have finally decided a place is safe enough to fully let go. She looked at the 7 vessels, riding calm and settled in their new berths. She looked at the current chart she had drawn at midnight, tacked up straight on the harbor board. Then she looked at Emmett, and something in her expression settled. The last of the careful reassessment, giving way to something quieter and more certain. "You need a harbor navigator," she said. "Your south approach is wrong on 3 charts. Your east mooring has no one who can read the tidal set, and your capstan has been seized since March." She paused. "I fixed the capstan. I noticed," Emmett said. The trade fleet calls at this headland every 6 weeks, she said. They won't come in without me. That's 7 ships, reliably, through the season. She looked at him. I would need the storeroom through the winter. Wren needs a school, if there is one. There's one, Emmett said, 3 streets back, Miss Halwell. She's good. Sura nodded once, the way she nodded when a piece of information confirmed what she had already suspected. We only need the one night, she said. That was true this morning. She looked at the harbor, at the lanterns coming on as the light faded, at the warm glow of the office window behind them. I didn't know what this place was this morning. Emmett Caldwell had run this harbor alone for 7 years. He had kept it alive out of stubbornness, and something he wouldn't have called hope, but that looked, from the outside, almost exactly like it. He had posted the wrong chart on the board because no one had corrected it, and kept the broken capstan because there was no one to fix it, and watched the trade fleet stop calling because there was no one left on the dock. They trusted to bring them through the channel safely. He had offered one night a cot and a stove and the chandler's wool blankets. That was all, he said. Stay as long as you need. That winter, Wren Vane started at Miss Howell's school and discovered she was considerably ahead in arithmetic. The trade fleet called every 6 weeks, as promised, 7 ships at first, and then in February 9. Norris the chandler took on an assistant. The cook from the second vessel started leaving a jar of coffee at the harbor office door on Tuesdays. And on the nights when the fog came back, as it always did along that stretch of coast, there were 2 people in the harbor office, one reading the log, one drawing charts, and a lamp burning in the storeroom window, where a small girl slept in a bed that had been her own for long enough that she longer thought about it being otherwise. It was not a grand thing, what Emmett Caldwell had done. He had taken a line and written a name in a register and offered a storeroom that was warmer than the cold. He had stood in a warden's doorway with a rulebook and a quiet voice and made sure the morning came out right. But the harbor was alive again, and the woman who had made it so was there and her daughter was there, and the lantern at the end of the pier burned warm in the gray water, a fixed point in the fog. That was the whole of it. It was enough.